have our speakers go, is that the horse is out of the barn. As Nicole said, a stream management plan is likely coming to you or is already happening in your area. This is happening all over the state. And irrigators can participate or not, but if not, the process will clearly not include critical stakeholders. And a few things to just think about if you are participating in these, and things that you should highlight, is that prior appropriation is our system. And that is something that needs to be stated often, and you can't state that enough. And that senior water rights will be protected, and senior water rights are most often agreed for irrigation. And if stream management options benefit from changes in flow, it is important to remember that agriculture users hold all the cards in these situations. So we're going to get started, and there was a few more things. I forgot about this. And so we're talking about stream management plans, and it could be, if you're involved in these, it's an opportunity to really assure people about the benefits of agriculture. I think this is something that is lost on a lot of people. They can say, well, they use this amount of water, or this kind of diversion, but I think people really don't understand the recreational, the environmental, just the fact that you grow food for the rest of us, and what agriculture does, and just how irrigation systems work. Where a lot of people will see something that looks like waste, and they don't really understand the intricacies of your irrigation system. And this is also an opportunity for you to highlight what agriculture does for Colorado, and make sure that people understand current irrigation practices. I'm sure you've heard it before that, well, why don't they all just put in drip tape? That'll save water. Or why don't they all just do this? And those conversations are a lot more difficult. And I think it's another opportunity to explain what it's like for water use in agriculture. And then, again, make sure that stakeholder meetings are convenient for you, since you will likely be the only people involved who are not being paid to be involved. This is why we tried to do this meeting in the evening, because I understand some people are pretty busy during the day, but that is something to think about, that for the producers in the room, that when you're in these plans and in a process like this, no one's paying you to be there. And I think for the other people who are not producers, that's something to bear in mind, is no one's covering their mileage, no one's paying for their hotel, and these are factors that need to be taken into account. If you have to meet them on their ranch, you have to meet them on their ranch. All right, well, I'm going to get started here in a sec, so if each of our speakers would just introduce themselves briefly, and then we'll get started.
I'm Tom Alvey. I'm from the North Fork Valley. I grow fruit there. I'm on the North Fork Water Conservancy District Board and the Colorado River Water Conservation Board. Bill Trampe, Upper Gunnison, upstream of the Blue Mesa. I've served on the Upper Gunnison River Water Conservancy District for 26 years, back in the 70s and 80s, and since then I've been on the Colorado River District Board representing Gunnison.
I'm Paul Bruchez. 5 generations of farming and ranching in the Bruchez family in Colorado. My family runs cows and grow hay. We irrigate out of the Williams Fork River, the Colorado River, and Reeder Creek, just outside of Kremmling. I'm the ag rep to the Colorado Basin Roundtable, and I supplement my ranching ways as being a fishing guide, just how you know I'm not very intelligent.
I just want to thank these 3 gentlemen for coming up here today. I kind of have to scour the state to find producers who are involved in stream management plans and willing to talk about it, and so I really appreciate it, so thank you so much. And Mr. Trampe, are you ready?
We'll find out. I guess I'd just like to start by saying that I hope you listened to Nicole, and I hope you just heard what Greg was talking about, because those are, I think, Nicole's description of watershed management is very important, to make it an integrated system. And I guess to start off with, in the Gunnison Basin, as a result of the roundtable and the water plan process, we had I guess a community advocate decided that was a thing that we needed to do, is we had to have a stream management plan in the Gunnison Basin. And so he gathered up a bunch of the recreational people and the enviro people and proceeded to start doing a stream management plan. And I knew what was going on, and I tried to encouraged some of the ag producers to get involved in it, and nobody wanted to step forward. So I basically inserted myself in the process as a stakeholder. And we had some really tough times a couple of years ago, getting them to recognize the fact that, you know, just because they wanted to improve the fishery in a certain stretch of the river, it wasn't going to be as easy as they thought it was, because they were going to have to infringe upon somebody's water right in order to do that. And that led to the opportunity for ag producers to get involved. And I think early on in that kind of a process, the ag producers became interested, concerned more than interested, I think, because they could see the handwriting on the wall of what the process was at that point in time. It was the Trout Unlimited people, and I don't mean to get after you, Richard, but that's what was felt in the Gunnison Basin. It was Trout Unlimited and the enviros out to improve the streams for fishery with the exclusion of everything else. And we kind of went down that road for a couple of 3 months, and I kept picking on him about, you know, let's think about this. If you're going to take water away from agriculture and put it in a stream in the middle of the summer or for earlier parts of the summer, what's that going to do to the aquifer? And we couldn't understand how flood irrigation had anything to do with the aquifer. And we finally had a discussion, and some of them began to realize that you needed to fill that aquifer, and that's what the cowboys were doing when they were flood irrigating in the spring, and that was beneficial to the stream later in the season. So we kind of talked about that and got some of those things ironed out. They decided that they wanted to go to the CWCB for a grant to help fund their system. They found out in order to do that, they were going to have some matching money. They were going to have a sponsor and all that kind of thing. And so about that time, the Upper Gunnison Conservancy District manager was sitting in on these meetings, and so they went to Frank Kugel and they said, would the Upper Gunnison be our sponsor? So where we are today, a couple of years later, is the Upper Gunnison Conservancy District, Water Conservancy District, is basically the sponsor of the project. And they got us a CWCB grant, but the Upper Gunnison is matching the dollars to take care of the things that Nicole was talking about earlier in the evening. So today, I guess where we're at is they finally decided, that all of us decided that the first thing that we needed to do is we needed to have an inventory of what was really happening on these streams. Well, that was going to be a very big job, so instead of taking over the entire basin at one time, we decided to break off into the various tributaries. And the first two tributaries were the Ohio Creek and the East River. If you know anything about the Gunnison Basin, that's north of Gunnison. And East River runs from Crested Butte to Almont, where it joins the Taylor and forms the Gunnison. And the Ohio Creek is kind of on the western side of the valley, downstream kind of from Crested Butte, but it's west of Crested Butte. So the first one that's really getting the initial inventory and needs assessment is Ohio Creek, and then the East River will follow. They're beginning some basic work in the Lake Fork and the Powderhorn, which is the Savoia. And then ultimately we'll go to the Tamich in the main stem of the Gunnison. I think they selected the Ohio Creek. It's water deficient, very water deficient, over appropriated. Historically, lots and lots of irrigated meadow. Lots of new ownership in the valley, in the Ohio Creek Valley. So you have a change in philosophy about the people that own the ground. And they bought the ground not necessarily for its good agricultural production capacity, but it's because of the wildlife and the aesthetics and the view corridors and all those kinds of things that people have come and bought ranches in the Ohio Creek Valley. It's water deficient. They want to make a fishery. And so they're the ones that are pushing to get the stream flows in the river, in the stream, when they can fish, you know. No storage. There's no storage on any of these streams that we're talking about except the Lake Fork. And so there's not a pool of water to draw on. So it's all, any rearrangement of stream flows is going to be as a result of senior water rights. And I don't know how that's all going to sort out. But as I say, we're going through an inventory process right now, and it needs assessment. And so, in the next 3 or 4 months, between now and in the middle of the summer, on particularly the Ohio Creek and the East River to some degree, we'll be identifying what the total inventory is. Wilson Water was hired to do an analysis of the water rights and the irrigated acreage things with a subcontract out to an environmental consultant that's doing an environmental assessment as well. So we're trying to cover all the bases before we start making any decisions. And so the whole process is kind of cooled down now as far as public sentiment, but when the assessments and the inventories and the projects are all laid on the table, I'm sure things will kick up again as far as interest from the community. And I'm hoping that we can keep the agricultural community involved. It's been very difficult to keep the cowboys at the table talking about things. Greg talked about meeting times. Well, all of the early meeting dates were in the afternoon or over the lunch hour or something like that. And now we're meeting finally in the evening, starting at 5 o'clock, which is not all that conducive to ag participation either. But I hope that when they get back and really get after the process, that maybe we can go to 6 o'clock in the evening. But again, all the people that are coming to these meetings, at the exception of agriculture, people basically that are paid or get grants to go to meetings. So that's kind of where we are. I guess I'm struggling myself trying to figure out what ag can get out of the process. People on the other side of the aisle from me talk about, well, we'll build you new head gates, we'll build you new diversion structures, we'll build you all those kinds of things. Well, if you've been doing a decent job and living up to what the division engineer and the state engineer want you to do, you should be in pretty good shape that way on streams that are over appropriated and where administration's been taking place, which has occurred quite frequently in the Gunnison Basin. So I'm not sure that that's a great carrot to stick on the tree for us. I will say, for my own benefit, I think one of the best things that can happen is this is an opportunity for agriculture to educate our fellow citizens about water use. And not only that we're the water rights owners, but all the other benefits that we provide. And I'll give you an example. The guy that kicked this whole thing off in the Gunnison Basin has been involved in water issues for a long time. He used to run the water workshop at Western State, Sibley. And he's the guy that really wants this to work. And I don't criticize him for it, but an example of how he thinks, a retired college professor, I discussed with him many times about the aquifer and the storage that the ranchers provided the aquifer and how it comes back to the stream, and how if you start irrigating with sprinklers or gated pipe or any of those kind of efficiency things, that was going to affect the aquifer. And how was that going to affect the late season stream flows? And we had lots of discussions about that. It just didn't ever seem to sink into George. Last week, he went on one of those producer interviews with Aaron Wilson, where Aaron was interviewing the rancher about his diversion and how he used it and the time of year that he irrigated and the times of year that he did not divert and all those kinds of things. And I guess during the course of the conversation, they talked about, Aaron probably asked Bert Guerreri if he would consider going to sprinklers or pipe and ditches and stuff, and Bert said no for all the reasons most of us ranchers in the high country say no. Well, anyway, a couple of nights later, I was at the Upper Gunnison meeting, and I sat there and listened to George say, you know, I learned something the other day with Aaron, that, you know, if we were going to ask these cowboys to put all their water in the pipes, that's going to really affect the habitat. And I've been talking to him about this stuff for years and it didn't go in, but he would listen to Aaron. So I think, you know, bringing new people into the process, a new voice, a new way of talking about these things is beneficial. So I think that's one of the main things. Another example I'd like to throw out, it's not specifically related to this issue, but it's an experience that I've had in the Gunnison Basin over all these years. We have one storage vessel upstream of Blue Mesa, and that's Taylor Reservoir. And it's owned by the Uncompahgre Water Users and the Bureau of Reclamation. And back in the 70s, the Upper Gunnison decided to file a second fill right on that reservoir, and it was a long process, but we got a second fill right. And so today we use that second fill right when it's available to supplement agriculture, irrigation, provide flows in the Gunnison River for fishery and recreation, and provide a better management of the flat water resource up on the reservoir itself. And so in order to do that, we put together what we call our Taylor Local Users Group. And there's people represented on that from agriculture, fishery people, recreationist people, floating, and then the flat water issues at the reservoir itself. And the one kicker in all this process is there's one gentleman owns an in-stream flow right in Taylor Canyon. And so he is part of the whole process too. He got that water right, or some people filed on that water right before the CWCB was the only individual or entity that could own an in-stream flow right. So we've had to deal with that over all these years in the Gunnison Basin. But long story short, when we first started this process back in the late 70s, agriculture was pretty important. And I wouldn't say we ruled the roost over how that water was released, but we had a pretty good say in how that water is released and used. Today, agriculture is the last one in consideration on that released water. And, you know, it's important to agriculture on the Gunnison River to have an early release to benefit the early diversions on the river in late May, early to late May, and then it's important to agriculture late in the season. And we don't really care about it in late July and August while we're haying. That's where it's important for the recreation community to float. And so everybody's made the conscious decision, and I was part of the process, that recreation and tourism and fishery issue was a great economic boost to our community, and therefore that was the most important thing. And so now, basically, those releases are to generate more flow in the river in July and August than it is to do anything else. And I mean, that's just something that the community did, but that shows you that if agriculture isn't at the table yelling pretty strongly, that's what happens in today's society. So I just throw that out there.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I think one thing before I get started that, you know, what Bill's talk had to do with versus what you're going to hear from me in Grand County is why local planning is really so important in this, because locations are so different and so varied as they lie. So in Grand County, we are very heavily trans-mountain diverted. So a lot of the water that originates in our area doesn't exist in our watersheds and in our systems. So the brief history, you know, Greg said we had 15 minutes to talk, and it's like, man, I can't even define the ILVK in 15 minutes. So I guess the solution is to speed through this with a lot of acronyms to try and confuse all of you so that none of you know what I'm talking about. Be my goal. So where my family lives is in a stretch of the main stem of the Colorado River that prior to the construction of the Colorado Big Thompson project, the landowners in that area had no water rights. The valley flooded every year. When water came down, landowners went out and gathered what they could of debris and did what they did with the land, largely because of the pinch of the geography of Gore Canyon. So when they constructed the Colorado Big Thompson project, specific to Lake Granby as well as Green Mountain Reservoir, they knew that they were taking the peak of that flow off and that would no longer happen. So they gave landowners water rights along with irrigation systems to then irrigate the land. The land through the lower part of that valley is so flat that rather than traditional headgate diversions, most of them were installed with fixed station pump systems to pump water from the river up onto the land. So with a history of continued trans-mountain diversions going on through Windy Gap, and as you saw on Phil's screen earlier with Windy Gap firming projects and also Moffett firming project, Grand County, coming into the early mid-2000s, was in a little bit of a predicament as both Denver and Northern pursued those projects. The plan came about specific to the fact that we needed more scientific evidence as a county about what was actually happening with our river system. Instead of saying, no, you can't take more, we have to protect what we have, we had to find science to defend some of the contracts that existed dating back to some of the agreements of these storage reservoirs and the water rights. When Grand County chose to do that, it was very aggressive, I would say, and needs-based, based on timing. 2002, 3, and 4 for the Upper Colorado were very bleak, historically some of our driest years ever. And really, after Windy Gap Reservoir was constructed, which is a shallow reservoir right where the Fraser River and Colorado Rivers confluence to pump water back up into Lake Granby, we had never seen a drought of this magnitude. So it's the first time that all of the contracts, agreements, deals, and we actually looked at a river as ag producers. And in order to get our water rights, we were drying up the main stem of the Colorado River at Kremmling, and knew that couldn't be right. That wasn't how these contracts and agreements were intended to be. So as Grand County continued in negotiations, holding 1041 authority on some of the permitting process, they kind of steamrolled ahead. We're very fortunate at the time. Lurleen Curran, our county manager, had a background very deeply tied to agriculture, as also a passion for her community and recreation and others. And it wasn't that agriculture was overlooked, but it was that there was such a need to move forward with this process that it couldn't be delayed. When conversations started in that same time frame with the agriculture community, it was fairly typical of what you'd expect, and people really didn't want to talk. They didn't want to talk about how much water they used or problems with their pumps. Some of these neighbors and people specific to, forgot, the ILVK, they gave us a title. It's actually the irrigators of the lands in the vicinity of Kremmling. And that's what the binding documents of Senate Document 80 for the Colorado Big Thompson project actually called us. We've got a cool dance to it and other things, but